Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The biting cold of February 2023 nipped at my exposed skin as I trudged through the knee-deep snow, my backpack feeling heavier with each step. At 32 years old, I considered myself an experienced hiker, but the Adirondack high peaks in winter were a different beast altogether. My hiking partner Ryan was a few paces ahead, his breath visible in the frigid air. We had set out early that morning, our goal to summit one of the most challenging peaks in the range. The forecast had promised clear skies, but as we ascended, an ominous blanket of clouds began to roll in, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. The trail narrowed as we climbed higher, hemmed in by towering pines laden with snow. Their branches creaked and groaned under the weight, the sound eerily human-like in the stillness of the forest. More than once, I found myself whipping around, certain I'd heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind us, only to be met with an empty trail. "Did you hear that?" I called out to Ryan, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the muffled quiet of the snow-covered wilderness. He paused, turning back to me with a quizzical look. "Hear what?" I shook my head, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that had been building since we left the trailhead. "Nothing, I guess. This place just feels off somehow." Ryan chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Come on, man. It's just the cold getting to you. We're almost to the summit." As we pushed on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and whipping snow into our faces. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and I found myself checking my GPS more frequently, desperate for the reassurance that we were still on track. The summit, when we finally reached it, should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, as we stood atop the windswept peak, I felt only a growing sense of dread. The view that should have stretched for miles was obscured by swirling snow and mist, giving the impression that we were standing at the edge of the world. Ryan raised his arms in victory, whooping into the wind, but his celebration felt hollow, drowned out by the howling gale. As I turned in a slow circle, taking in our surroundings, my eye caught on something dark against the white expanse of snow. Curiosity overrode my apprehension, and I trudged over to investigate. As I drew closer, my blood ran cold. There, half buried in the snow, was a single black glove. It wasn't the glove itself that sent a shiver down my spine, but what lay beside it. A perfect impression of a hand, fingers splayed wide, as if someone had reached up through the snow from below. "Ryan," I called, my voice shaking. "You need to see this." He joined me, his face paling as he took in the disturbing scene. That's not possible," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "The wind, it must have..." But we both knew that no wind could have created such a perfect imprint. And as we stood there, staring at the impossible handprint, I could have sworn I saw the fingers twitch, just slightly, as if beckoning us closer. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing Ryan's arm. "Now." He nodded, all thoughts of celebrating our summit forgotten. As we turned to begin our descent, a sound reached us, faint at first, but growing stronger. It was laughter, high and cruel, carried on the wind from somewhere in the swirling mist that surrounded us. We didn't speak as we practically ran down the trail, our earlier caution forgotten in our haste to put as much distance between us and the summit as possible. The laughter seemed to follow us, always just at the edge of hearing, taunting and malevolent. As the light began to fade, we realized we wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before nightfall. With heavy hearts and frayed nerves, we began to set up camp in a small clearing, both of us jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of wind through the trees. That night, as we huddled in our tent, the temperature plummeting around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every gust of wind sounded like whispered voices. Every shadow outside the tent took on sinister shapes. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares of dark figures reaching up through the snow, their icy fingers grasping at my ankles. The first rays of dawn brought little comfort as Ryan and I emerged from our tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. The events of the previous day hung over us like a shroud, unspoken but impossible to ignore. The forest around us seemed different in the pale morning light. Darker somehow, the shadows deeper and more menacing. As we packed up our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had been moved during the night. My backpack, which I distinctly remembered placing by the tent entrance, was now several feet away, half buried in snow. Ryan's boots, left neatly by the fire pit, were now facing the opposite direction, as if someone had worn them and carelessly discarded them. Did you move any of our stuff last night?" I asked Ryan, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He looked at me, confusion and fear warring in his eyes. "No, I didn't leave the tent. You know that." I nodded, swallowing hard. We both knew what that meant, but neither of us dared voice the implication aloud. With our camp packed up, we set off down the trail, eager to put this cursed mountain behind us. The snow from the previous day had continued through the night, covering our tracks and transforming the landscape into an alien, featureless expanse of white. More than once we had to consult our map and GPS to ensure we were still on the right path. As we descended, the forest grew denser, the trees pressing in close on either side of the trail. Their branches, heavy with snow, formed a canopy overhead, blotting out what little sunlight managed to penetrate the cloud cover. It felt as if we were walking through a tunnel, the world beyond the trail fading into impenetrable darkness. About an hour into our hike, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Alongside our own footprints in the fresh snow were another set of tracks. They hadn't been there when we started out, I was certain of it. These new prints were larger than ours, with an odd, shuffling gait that spoke of something not quite human. I grabbed Ryan's arm, pointing wordlessly at the tracks. His face paled as he followed my gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Maybe it's just another hiker," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "In this weather? And look at the way they move. That's not normal." As if in response to my words, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, causing both of us to freeze in terror. It was close, too close, and filled with a primal hunger that sent shivers down my spine. "Run," I whispered, and then we were off, plunging through the snow with reckless abandon, our earlier caution forgotten in our desperation to escape whatever was lurking in the forest around us. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs trembled, finally collapsing against a large boulder, gasping for breath. As we huddled there, trying to calm our racing hearts, I realized with growing horror that I no longer recognized our surroundings. In our panic, we had veered off the trail, and now found ourselves in a part of the forest I had never seen before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted into grotesque shapes. Their bare branches reached toward the sky like grasping fingers, and the snow beneath them was stained a sickly gray. The air felt thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of decay. "We need to find the trail," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "If we can just get back to the trail, we'll be okay." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We set off again, moving more slowly now, our eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of the path we had lost. But as the hours wore on and the light began to fade once more, it became clear that we were hopelessly lost. As night fell, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold, we were forced to make camp once again. This time, however, there was no clearing, no relatively safe spot to pitch our tent. We wedged ourselves between two large boulders, creating a makeshift shelter with our tarp. The night that followed was the longest of my life. The darkness pressed in around us, absolute and suffocating. Strange noises echoed through the forest, snapping branches, rustling leaves, and occasionally, something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, my hand clutching the small canister of bear spray we had brought along. It seemed woefully inadequate against whatever was out there, but it was the only weapon we had. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, I awoke to find Ryan shaking me urgently. "Listen," he hissed, his eyes wide with fear. At first I heard nothing but the wind. Then, slowly, another sound reached my ears. Footsteps, crunching through the snow. They were moving slowly, deliberately, circling our makeshift camp, and they were getting closer. We huddled together, hardly daring to breathe, as the footsteps drew nearer. They paused just on the other side of our tarp, and I could hear heavy, ragged breathing. Something scraped against the fabric, and I had to bite back a scream. For what felt like hours, we sat there, frozen in terror, as whatever was outside continued its slow circuit around our shelter. Eventually, mercifully, the footsteps began to recede, fading into the distance until all we could hear once more was the mournful howling of the wind. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we packed up our meager camp with shaking hands and set off once more, desperate to find our way back to civilization. As Ryan and I stumbled through the endless expanse of snow-covered forest, the events of the past 2 days began to take their toll. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, our muscles aching with each step, our minds clouded by fear and confusion. The growling of our empty stomachs was a constant reminder of how ill-prepared we were for this extended ordeal. The day wore on, the weak winter sun barely penetrating the dense canopy above. We trudged forward, our spirits sinking with each passing hour as we failed to find any sign of the trail or civilization. The forest seemed to be playing tricks on us, landmarks appearing familiar only to change as we approached, leading us in circles. It was mid-afternoon when we first heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the bare branches overhead. But as I listened more closely, I could make out words, faint, indistinct, but undeniably there. I glanced at Ryan, hoping he would tell me I was imagining things. But the look of wide-eyed terror on his face told me he heard them too. Lost forever. The wind seemed to sigh. Never escape. Came another whisper, this time from behind us. We quickened our pace, pushing through the deep snow with renewed desperation. The whispers followed, growing louder and more numerous, until it felt like we were surrounded by a crowd of unseen speakers. "Look!" Ryan suddenly cried out, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could make out a structure, a small, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. It was the first sign of human habitation we'd seen in days, and despite its rundown appearance, it represented hope. As we approached, however, that hope quickly turned to dread. The cabin's windows were dark, empty sockets, the glass long since shattered. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. And there, carved deeply into the weathered wood of the doorframe, were 2 words that made my blood run cold. Turn back. We stood there, frozen in indecision. The logical part of my mind screamed that we should heed the warning, that nothing good could come from entering this ominous structure. But we were cold, hungry, and desperately in need of shelter. The promise of 4 walls and a roof, no matter how decrepit, was too tempting to resist. We have to go in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll freeze if we spend another night outside." Ryan nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. Together, we pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the gloom of the cabin. The interior was a scene of decay and abandonment. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, disturbed only by the small tracks of animals that had sought shelter here over the years. In one corner stood a rusted iron stove, a pile of ancient, rotting firewood beside it. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. One of the chairs toppled onto its side. But it was the far wall that drew our attention and sent shivers of fear racing down our spines. Every inch of the rough-hewn logs was covered in tally marks, thousands upon thousands of them, carved deeply into the wood, and scrawled above them, in large jagged letters, "Days trapped." "Oh God," Ryan breathed, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here now." I couldn't have agreed more, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cabin. Ryan rushed to it, pulling with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" he cried, panic rising in his voice. "Something's holding it closed." I joined him, and together we threw our weight against the door, but to no avail. It was as if the entire forest was pressing against the other side, trapping us inside this nightmare. As night fell, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, we huddled together in a corner, our backs pressed against the wall of tally marks. The temperature dropped rapidly, our breath visible in the feeble light of our single flashlight. That's when the whispering started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from outside. The voices seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabin, a cacophony of tormented souls sharing their tales of endless days trapped in this forest prison. Can't escape. It's always watching. The forest claims all. We covered our ears, trying to block out the maddening whispers, but they seemed to penetrate directly into our minds. Hours passed like this, each moment an eternity of terror and despair. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when the urge to claw at the walls and scream into the uncaring darkness became almost overwhelming, everything went silent. The sudden absence of the whispers was almost as terrifying as their presence had been. And then, in that profound silence, we heard it. Heavy footsteps in the snow outside circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, drawing ever closer to the door. Ryan and I looked at each other, our faces pale with fear in the dim light of the flashlight. Whatever had been stalking us through the forest had finally found us. And as the door began to creak open, we realized with dawning horror that our nightmare was far from over. The door of the cabin swung open with agonizing slowness, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. Ryan and I pressed ourselves further into the corner, our hearts pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear them. A gust of frigid air swept into the cabin, bringing with it the scent of decay and something else. Something ancient and malevolent. The darkness seemed to coalesce, taking on an almost tangible form as it slithered into the room. I felt Ryan tense beside me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My own heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins as every instinct screamed at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. As our eyes strained to penetrate the gloom, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form seeming to shift and writhe as if it couldn't decide on a single shape. Long, spindly limbs ended in wickedly sharp claws that scraped against the wooden floor as it moved. But it was the face, or rather the lack of one, that truly chilled me to my core. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of shadow. Yet somehow, I knew it was looking at us, studying us with an alien intelligence that radiated malice. For what felt like an eternity, the entity stood there, unmoving. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. Then slowly, it began to move towards us. Each step it took seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Frost began to form on the walls, creeping patterns of ice that spread with unnatural speed. As it drew closer, I could hear whispers again, not from the walls this time, but emanating from the creature itself. Countless voices, some pleading, some screaming, all filled with unimaginable terror. Just as the entity reached out one of its grotesque limbs towards us, Ryan suddenly sprang into action. With a primal yell, he lunged forward, swinging our flashlight like a club. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I saw the creature in its entirety. I wish I hadn't. The sight of it in that brief flash of illumination was enough to make my mind recoil, unable to fully process the impossible geometry of its form. It was as if someone had taken every nightmare, every primal fear buried deep in the human psyche, and given it physical form. The flashlight connected with what passed for the creature's head, and to our shock and horror, it passed right through as if the entity was made of smoke. The momentum of Ryan's swing carried him forward, and he stumbled, falling to the floor at the thing's feet. I watched in paralyzed terror as the creature's form seemed to ripple, and then it began to absorb Ryan. There's no other word for it. It was as if the darkness itself was consuming him, pulling him in despite his desperate struggles. Ryan's screams filled the cabin, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my days. I wanted to help him, to pull him back, but my body refused to respond. I could only watch in mute horror as my friend was drawn into the impossible darkness of the entity's form. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Ryan was gone, and the creature turned its eyeless gaze upon me. In that moment, as I stared into the abyss of its non-face, I felt something within me break. The fear, the horror, the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing, it was too much for my mind to bear. I felt myself slipping away, consciousness fleeing in the face of this unknowable terror. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was the sensation of icy tendrils wrapping around my body, pulling me towards that all-consuming void. I awoke with a start, my heart racing and my body drenched in cold sweat. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling the snow-covered ground around me. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented and confused. Where was I? What had happened? Then, with a rush of terror, the memories came flooding back. The cabin, the entity, Ryan's horrifying fate. I sat up abruptly, my eyes darting around wildly, half expecting to see that nightmarish form lurking behind every tree. But I was alone in the forest. The cabin was nowhere to be seen, no sign of the terrifying events of the previous night visible in the peaceful winter landscape that surrounded me. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? As I struggled to my feet, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My clothes were different. Instead of the heavy winter gear I'd been wearing, I was now dressed in what looked like old-fashioned hiking attire: wool pants, a canvas jacket, and leather boots that seemed to belong to another era entirely. I reached for my backpack, hoping to find my phone, my GPS, anything that could help me make sense of what was happening. But it was gone, along with all of my modern equipment. In its place was an old, weathered rucksack that I had never seen before. With shaking hands, I opened the rucksack, finding only a few meager supplies inside: a canteen of water, some hardtack, and a box of matches. At the bottom, I found a small, leather-bound journal. Opening it, I saw that most of the pages were filled with cramped, desperate-looking handwriting. The date on the first entry made me gasp in disbelief: February 15th, 1923. As I flipped through the journal, a picture began to emerge. A picture that filled me with a dread unlike anything I had ever experienced. The journal belonged to a hiker named Thomas Blackwood, who had come to these mountains a century ago. He wrote of becoming lost in the forest, of encounters with impossible creatures, of time seeming to loop and stretch in ways that defied explanation. The final entry, dated simply day, read, "The forest is alive. It hungers. We are not lost. We are trapped. God help us all." I dropped the journal as if it had burned me, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. And yet, as I looked around at the primeval forest that surrounded me, at the antiquated clothing I now wore, a terrible realization began to dawn. I hadn't escaped the horror of the cabin. I had been drawn deeper into it. With no other option, I shouldered the unfamiliar rucksack and began to walk. The forest seemed different now, older somehow. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than any I had seen before, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes overhead. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath my feet and the occasional distant cry of some unseen animal. As I walked, I began to notice things, small details that sent shivers down my spine. Claw marks gouged deep into tree trunks. Patches of snow stained a dark, rusty color that I tried to convince myself wasn't blood. And everywhere, always just at the edge of my vision, fleeting shadows that vanished when I turned to look at them directly. The day wore on, the weak winter sun tracing its arc across the sky with agonizing slowness. I walked for hours, my feet carrying me forward almost of their own volition. Yet no matter how far I went, the forest remained unchanging, an endless expanse of snow and twisted trees. As night began to fall once more, I knew I needed to find shelter. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I had no illusions about my chances of surviving a night in the open. Just as despair was beginning to set in, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees ahead. Hope surged within me, and I quickened my pace. As I drew closer, I saw that the light was coming from the window of a small cabin. A cabin that looked disturbingly familiar. My steps faltered as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But where would I go? The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it would never let me leave. With a sense of inescapable dread, I pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was exactly as I remembered it. The rusted stove, the overturned chair, the wall covered in tally marks. But there was one crucial difference. Huddled in the corner, wide-eyed with terror, was a man dressed in the same old-fashioned clothing I now wore. As he looked up at me, I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. Who are you?" he stammered. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a gust of frigid air swept into the cabin from the still open door. With it came the sound of heavy footsteps in the snow outside, drawing ever closer. As I turned to face the darkness beyond the threshold, I realized with dawning horror that the cycle was beginning anew. And this time, I was not the victim, but the witness to another soul's imminent terror. The true nature of the forest's curse was finally becoming clear, and the revelation was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The newcomer in the cabin scrambled to his feet, pressing himself against the wall of tally marks as if trying to meld with the wood itself. His eyes darted between me and the open door, confusion and fear warring on his face. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Who are you? What is this place?" I opened my mouth to respond, to warn him of the impending danger, but found that no words would come. It was as if some unseen force had robbed me of my voice, leaving me a mute spectator to the unfolding horror. The heavy footsteps outside grew louder, accompanied now by a low, guttural growling that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, our breath visible in rapidly forming clouds. I knew what was coming. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something, anything, to prevent the nightmarish scene I had witnessed before from repeating itself. But my body refused to obey, leaving me rooted to the spot as the darkness at the door began to coalesce into that terrifying, shapeless form. The man in the corner let out a strangled cry as the entity fully materialized. Like before, it was a thing of shadow and nightmares, its form constantly shifting and writhing in ways that defied comprehension. The eyeless void of its face turned towards the newcomer, and I could feel the weight of its alien attention pressing down on us both. What happened next was both familiar and horrifyingly new. The creature advanced on the terrified man, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. But this time I could see more. Details that my fear-addled mind had missed during my own encounter. As it moved, the entity left trails of inky darkness in its wake, tendrils of shadow that seemed to cling to the walls and floor of the cabin. And within those shadows, I could see faces, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, all contorted in expressions of agony and terror. I recognized some of those faces. Ryan was there, his features frozen in a silent scream. And others too. Hikers I had passed on the trail in what now felt like another lifetime, their disappearances now explained in the most horrific way possible. The man in the corner began to scream as the creature reached for him, its form expanding and engulfing him just as it had done to Ryan. But this time, I could see the process in excruciating detail. It wasn't just his body being consumed, but something more. His very essence, his soul, being drawn into the writhing mass of the entity. As the man's screams faded, replaced by the cacophony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the creature itself, I felt something within me shift. The paralysis that had held me in place began to lift, and with it came a surge of memories that were not my own. I saw flashes of other times, other victims, an endless parade of lost souls drawn into this forest over decades, perhaps centuries. Each one trapped in this cabin, facing the same unknowable horror, their fear and despair feeding the insatiable hunger of the forest itself. And I realized, with a clarity that threatened to shatter my sanity, that I was now a part of this cycle. Not just a victim, but a herald of doom for those who would come after me. The forest had claimed me, just as it had claimed Thomas Blackwood 100 years before, and countless others since. As the entity finished its gruesome feast and turned its attention to me once more, I felt no fear. Instead, a sort of numb acceptance washed over me. I knew now that there was no escape, no salvation. The forest would never let us leave. The creature approached, its form rippling with the faces of its victims. As it reached out to me with limbs of pure darkness, I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold embrace that would draw me fully into this eternal nightmare. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a surge of something. Power, knowledge. I couldn't be sure. But when I opened my eyes again, the entity was gone, and I was alone in the cabin once more. The wall of tally marks caught my eye, and I moved towards it as if in a trance. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and I found myself adding a new mark to the countless others. As I did so, I felt a connection to the forest, to the entity, to all those who had come before me. I understood then what my role was to be. I was to be the watcher, the keeper of this dark place. I would bear witness to the suffering of others, unable to intervene, unable to save them. And in doing so, I would feed the insatiable hunger of the forest. As night fell outside the cabin, I settled into my new existence. I knew that soon, another lost soul would stumble upon this place, seeking shelter from the dangers of the forest. And I would be here, waiting, a silent harbinger of the horrors to come. The forest had claimed me, body and soul. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very core that it would never, ever let me go. Time lost all meaning as I settled into my role as the silent guardian of the cabin. Days blended into nights, winters gave way to brief summers only to return again, all in a blur that I could no longer track or comprehend. The only constant was the arrival of new victims, each one stumbling into the cabin with hope in their eyes, only to have it brutally extinguished. I watched, an unwilling spectator, as hiker after hiker fell prey to the entity that I now understood was as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves. Each encounter was both horrifyingly familiar and uniquely terrible. the entity seeming to feed not just on the bodies of its victims, but on their fear, their despair, their very souls. With each cycle, I felt myself changing. The humanity that I had clung to so desperately at the beginning began to slip away, replaced by something older, colder, more alien. I began to understand the whispers that filled the cabin, the voices of the damned that echoed through the walls. They were a part of me now, their stories intertwining with my own until I could no longer distinguish where they ended, and I began. The forest, I came to realize, was more than just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, with the cabin serving as its dark heart. The entity that stalked its victims was merely an extension of its will, a manifestation of its insatiable hunger. And I, in my role as the watcher, had become another appendage of this vast, malevolent organism. There were times when I thought I glimpsed a way out, a potential escape from this endless cycle of horror. Sometimes, a particularly resourceful or perceptive victim would seem on the verge of understanding the true nature of the forest, of breaking free from its grasp. In those moments, I felt a glimmer of hope, not just for them, but for myself. But invariably, the forest would reassert its dominance. The entity would appear, more terrifying and powerful than ever, and another soul would be lost to its insatiable hunger. And with each failure, my own hope dwindled, until it became nothing more than a distant memory. As I stood vigil in the cabin, I began to understand the true scope of the forest's power. It wasn't confined to this small patch of wilderness in the Adirondacks. Its influence stretched far beyond, tendrils of dark energy reaching out to touch similar places of power around the world. I sensed connections to ancient woods in Europe, to mist-shrouded mountains in Asia, to the depths of unexplored jungles in South America. All linked, all part of a vast network of supernatural hunger and terror. And at the center of it all was this cabin, this small, unassuming structure that had become my eternal prison. I was its keeper, its witness, and increasingly, I feared, its accomplice. I don't know how long I had been trapped in this nightmarish existence when everything changed. Time had long since lost all meaning, the endless cycle of terror and death blurring into a single, eternal moment. But then, something unprecedented occurred. A group of hikers stumbled upon the cabin. Not one or two, as was usually the case, but 5 of them. They burst through the door in a flurry of modern Gore-Tex and high-tech gear, their faces flushed with cold and exertion. As they entered, I felt the familiar stirring of the entity, the air growing thick with its malevolent presence. But something was different this time. The hikers, instead of cowering in fear or freezing in shocked disbelief, seemed prepared. The leader of the group, a tall woman with fierce eyes, pulled out a strange device from her backpack. It hummed with an energy that made the air crackle, and I felt the entity recoil for the first time in my memory. "It's here," the woman said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "Just like the legend said, the heart of the dark forest." The others spread out, each producing similar devices. They began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices rising in a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. As they chanted, I felt a shift in the fabric of reality around us. The walls of the cabin began to waver, the countless tally marks squirming as if alive. The entity, usually so confident in its power, seemed to shrink back, its formless mass roiling with what I could only interpret as fear. For the first time in what felt like eons, I found my voice. What are you doing?" I croaked, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. The leader turned to me, her eyes widening in surprise. You're still here," she said, a mix of pity and determination in her voice. "We're ending this. We're breaking the cycle." As she spoke, the air in the cabin seemed to ignite. The devices the hikers held blazed with blinding light, and I felt a pain unlike anything I had experienced before. It was as if every death, every moment of terror and despair that I had witnessed over my long vigil, was being pulled from me all at once. The entity screamed, a sound so terrible and alien that it threatened to shatter my sanity anew. It thrashed and writhed, its form stretching and contorting as it tried to escape the purifying light. But there was nowhere for it to go. The hiker's chant reached a fever pitch, and with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the entity shattered. It exploded into countless fragments of The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I trudged through the fallen leaves, my two loyal companions, Rusty and Bella, trotting ahead, their tails wagging with unbridled enthusiasm. It was October 15th, 2023, and at 34 years old, I had settled into a comfortable routine of walking my dogs through Whispering Pines, a small forested area not far from my suburban home. Whispering Pines had always been a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the hustle and bustle of daily life seemed to fade away, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The forest wasn't large by any means, but its dense foliage and winding paths made it feel like an oasis of nature amidst the sprawling suburbia. As we ventured deeper into the woods that day, I couldn't shake an odd feeling that had been gnawing at me since we entered the forest. The air felt heavier somehow, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Rusty, my robust German shepherd, suddenly halted, his ears perked up and alert. Bella, the smaller but equally fierce border collie, followed suit. Their sudden stillness sent a chill down my spine. "What is it, guys?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. As if in response, Rusty let out a sharp bark that echoed through the trees. Before I could react, both dogs bolted, disappearing into a thick cluster of bushes ahead. "Rusty! Bella! Come back!" I called out, my heart racing as I sprinted after them. The undergrowth tugged at my clothes as I pushed through, branches scratching my arms and face. The dogs' barking grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a growing sense of dread with each step. Suddenly I burst into a small clearing, and the sight before me made me freeze in my tracks. Rusty and Bella stood rigid, their hackles raised, staring intently at something partially hidden behind a massive gnarled oak tree. As I approached, a foul odor assaulted my nostrils, a sickly sweet stench of decay that made my stomach churn. The air around us seemed to buzz, and as I drew closer, I realized the sound was coming from a swarm of flies hovering around. Something. With trembling hands, I reached for a fallen branch, using it to push aside the tall grass that obscured my view. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. There, nestled against the base of the oak, was a large burlap sack, roughly the size of a person. It was bound tightly with thick, frayed rope, and dark stains had seeped through the fabric in places. The flies swarmed around it in a frenzy, and I could see maggots writhing in the dampened earth beneath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A dead animal, perhaps? But why would someone go to the trouble of bagging it up like this, and why leave it here in the middle of Whispering Pines? I took a step closer, fighting against the urge to retch as the stench intensified. Using the branch, I gingerly prodded the sack. The contents shifted slightly, and a fresh wave of flies erupted from within, their angry buzzing filling the air. Something about the shape, the size. It struck a chord of primal fear within me. This was no animal. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Come on, guys," I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go. Now." Rusty and Bella seemed reluctant to leave, their eyes fixed on the grotesque bundle. I had to tug at their collars to get them moving, and even then they kept looking back, low growls rumbling in their throats. As we hurried back along the path, my mind was a whirlwind of horrific possibilities. Should I call the police? But what if I was wrong? What if it really was just some animal, and I ended up looking like a fool? The rational part of my brain argued that even if it was an animal, leaving a rotting carcass in a public forest was still cause for concern. But another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, just wanted to forget what I'd seen, and never return to that clearing again. By the time we emerged from Whispering Pines, my clothes were damp with sweat despite the cool air. I glanced back at the forest's edge, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us. But there was nothing except the gently swaying trees and the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. That night, as I lay in bed, the image of that burlap sack haunted my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it there, nestled against the oak tree, imagining what horrors it might contain. Sleep eluded me, and when I did finally drift off in the early hours of the morning, my dreams were filled with buzzing flies and the sickly sweet smell of decay. A week passed, but the memory of what I'd discovered in Whispering Pines refused to fade. It lingered in the back of my mind, an insidious presence that colored every aspect of my daily life. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, eyeing strangers with suspicion, and waking up in cold sweats, the phantom smell of decay clinging to my nostrils. I tried to go about my routine as normal, going to work at the local library, meeting friends for coffee, walking Rusty and Bella in the neighborhood park. But no matter what I did, my thoughts inevitably circled back to that clearing in the woods and the mysterious, horrifying sack. On October 22nd, exactly 1 week after the initial discovery, I found myself standing at the edge of Whispering Pines once again. The autumn sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the leaf-strewn ground. A chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the musty scent of decaying foliage. "This is insane," I muttered to myself, even as I took my first tentative steps into the forest. I had left Rusty and Bella at home this time, not wanting to risk them running off again or drawing attention to me. As I made my way deeper into the woods, following the now familiar path, every snapping twig and rustling leaf set my nerves on edge. The forest seemed different now, no longer the peaceful retreat I once knew. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision. Finally, I reached the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the spot where I had found the sack. But as I drew closer, I realized something was different. The sack was gone. In its place was a shallow pit, partially filled with loose soil. The ground around it was disturbed, with drag marks leading away from the site before disappearing into the underbrush. I stood there, frozen, as a myriad of emotions washed over me. Relief, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. Someone had been here. Someone had moved the sack and attempted to cover their tracks. Cautiously, I approached the pit, my eyes scanning the area for any clues. The foul odor still lingered, though it was fainter now, mingling with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. As I knelt down to examine the pit more closely, something caught my eye, a glint of white against the dark earth. With trembling fingers, I brushed away some of the loose soil, revealing what appeared to be a small bone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a human finger bone, stripped clean of flesh. I scrambled backward, my heart racing. This was no longer something I could ignore or rationalize away. I had to call the police. But as I fumbled for my phone, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my eyes wide with fear, scanning the deepening shadows between the trees. Was someone watching me? Had they been here all along, waiting to see if I would return? "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" Only the whisper of the wind through the leaves answered me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes upon me, hidden somewhere in the growing darkness of the forest. I backed away from the pit, my gaze darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. As the shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker, my imagination ran wild. Every tree trunk became a potential hiding place, every rustle of leaves a footstep drawing near. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I broke into a run, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I sped home, my mind raced with questions. Who had moved the sack? Why had they left that bone behind? And most chillingly, were they watching me even now? That night, as I paced my living room, debating whether or not to call the police, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The bone I had found was undeniable proof that something terrible had happened in Whispering Pines. But as I reached for my phone, a new thought stopped me cold. What if whoever was responsible for this knew who I was? What if they had followed me home? I rushed to check that all my doors and windows were locked, drawing the curtains tight. Rusty and Bella sensed my unease, staying close by my side, their eyes alert for any sign of danger. As I lay in bed that night, every creak of the house and gust of wind outside had me on edge. I knew that come morning, I would have to make a decision. I could no longer pretend that what I had seen in Whispering Pines was anything but evidence of a horrific crime. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. I went through the motions of my daily life, shelving books at the library, walking Rusty and Bella, buying groceries, but my mind was elsewhere, constantly replaying the gruesome discoveries in Whispering Pines. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that finger bone poking through the soil. Every sudden noise made me jump, convinced that whoever was responsible for the horrors in the forest had come for me. The rational part of my brain tried to argue that I was overreacting, that there was likely a logical explanation for everything. But the fear had taken root, growing like a malignant weed in the darkest corners of my mind. On October 25th, 3 days after my second visit to the clearing, I was working the evening shift at the library. The large, Gothic-style building had always felt comforting to me, with its towering shelves of books and the musty scent of old paper. But now, as closing time approached and the shadows lengthened between the stacks, I found myself on edge. As I was reshelving books in the true crime section, an irony not lost on me, I heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. I turned, expecting to see a late-night patron, but instead found myself face to face with Detective Hoffman, a gruff, middle-aged man I recognized from his frequent visits to the library's local history section. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Doing some research on local cold cases. Mind if I pick your brain about something?" My heart rate spiked. Did he know something? Had someone reported the sack in the woods after all? "Sure," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "What can I help you with?" Detective Hoffman pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. "Been looking into some missing persons cases from the area. Anything unusual happen around here lately? Any strange sightings or disturbances in the neighborhood?" I felt the blood drain from my face. This was my chance to tell someone in authority about what I had seen. But as I opened my mouth to speak, a chill ran down my spine. What if this wasn't a coincidence? What if Detective Hoffman was involved somehow? No, I lied, hating myself for it. Nothing unusual that I can think of. Hoffman's eyes narrowed slightly, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through me. "You sure about that? You seem a bit on edge." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Just tired, I guess. Been working a lot of late shifts lately." He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you do hear anything, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, you give me a call, all right?" He handed me his card, which I took with slightly trembling fingers. As Detective Hoffman walked away, I leaned against the bookshelf, my heart pounding. I had just lied to a police officer about potential evidence in what could be a murder case. What was wrong with me? But the seed of doubt had been planted. What if Hoffman wasn't really investigating? What if this was some sort of test to see if I would reveal what I knew? That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror seemed to stay there too long. Every car that passed me on the quiet suburban streets looked suspicious. When I finally reached my house, I sat in the driveway for several long minutes, scanning the street for any signs of surveillance. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of traffic breaking the silence. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and checking all the windows. Rusty and Bella greeted me with their usual enthusiasm, but even their presence couldn't fully ease my growing sense of dread. As I prepared for bed, a movement outside my bedroom window caught my eye. I froze, my heart in my throat, as I saw a shadowy figure dart between the trees at the edge of my backyard. It was there for only a moment before disappearing into the darkness, but it was enough to send me into a panic. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, Rusty and Bella on either side of me, jumping at every creak of the house settling and every gust of wind outside. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it the killer, coming to silence me? Was it Detective Hoffman, suspicious of my behavior at the library? Or was it all in my imagination, a product of my growing paranoia? As the first light of dawn began to creep through my curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers, and there was only one place I was going to find them. I was going back to Whispering Pines. The morning of October 26th dawned gray and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the grim task that lay ahead. I had called in sick to work, knowing I wouldn't be able to focus on anything but the mystery that had consumed my life. As I prepared to return to Whispering Pines, I tried to convince myself that I was being rational, that I was simply gathering information to take to the authorities. But deep down, I knew this was about more than just doing the right thing. It had become an obsession, a dark compulsion that I couldn't ignore. I dressed in dark clothes, hoping to blend in with the forest surroundings. In my backpack, I packed a flashlight, a small shovel, and my phone, though I doubted I'd have much signal once I was deep in the woods. As an afterthought, I slipped Detective Hoffman's card into my pocket, just in case. Rusty and Bella whined as I prepared to leave, sensing my anxiety. I knelt down to pet them, trying to draw comfort from their warm fur and unconditional love. "I'll be back soon," I promised, hoping it wasn't a lie. The drive to Whispering Pines was tense, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I constantly checked my rearview mirror for any signs of being followed. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of muted greens and browns under the overcast sky. As I parked at the small lot near the trailhead, a light drizzle began to fall, as if the very heavens were warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. I had come too far. The forest was different in the daylight, but no less menacing. The trees seemed to close in around me as I made my way deeper into the woods, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to hold me back. The soft patter of rain on leaves created a constant, unsettling white noise that set my nerves on edge. I found the clearing easily enough. Too easily, perhaps. The disturbed earth around the shallow pit was now muddy from the rain, but I could still make out the drag marks leading away from the site. Taking a deep breath, I unshouldered my backpack and took out the small shovel. My hands trembled as I began to dig, each scoop of earth revealing nothing. No more bones, no scraps of burlap, nothing to confirm the horrors I had witnessed. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? As I straightened up, wiping mud from my hands, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, to find myself face to face with Detective Hoffman. Funny running into you here, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Especially after you told me you hadn't seen anything unusual. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. Hoffman's eyes darted to the freshly dug earth, then back to me. His hand moved slowly towards his holster. I think you'd better come with me, he said. We have a lot to talk about. As he reached for my arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, causing both of us to freeze. It was followed by another, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. What happened next was a blur of motion and terror. A figure burst from the trees. No, not a figure, a thing. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long and joints bending in impossible ways. Its skin was a patchwork of different shades and textures, as if it had been stitched together from multiple bodies. Hoffman drew his gun, firing off 2 shots that seemed to have no effect. The creature lunged, its elongated fingers wrapping around the detective's throat. I stood paralyzed with fear as Hoffman's screams were cut short by a sickening crack. The creature's head swiveled towards me, revealing a face that was a nightmarish collage of mismatched features. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its inhuman shrieks growing closer with each passing second. Somehow, I made it to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I caught a glimpse of the thing emerging from the tree line, its misshapen body moving with an unnatural, loping gait. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature retreat back into the forest, but its haunting cry echoed in my ears long after Whispering Pines had disappeared from view. The next few days passed in a haze of terror and disbelief. I barricaded myself in my house, jumping at every sound, convinced that the monstrosity from Whispering Pines would come for me at any moment. Rusty and Bella sensed my distress, staying close and growling at shadows. I knew I should call the police, report what had happened to Detective Hoffman. But who would believe me? A tale of stitched-together monsters and murdered detectives sounded insane even to my own ears. And a part of me feared that if I did reach out, I'd only be drawing attention to myself, attention from whatever sinister forces were behind the horrors in the forest. On the 3rd day of my self-imposed isolation, a knock at the door sent me into a panic. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see a woman in her mid-40s with short, graying hair and kind eyes. She knocked again, more insistently this time. "Hello?" she called out. "I'm looking for the person who lives here. It's about Detective Hoffman." My blood ran cold. Had they found his body? Were they here to arrest me? Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack, the chain still in place. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm Detective Reeves," she said, holding up a badge. "I'm investigating the disappearance of my partner, James Hoffman. He was last seen heading to Whispering Pines, and your name came up in his notes. May I come in?" I hesitated, my mind racing. But something in her eyes, a mixture of concern and determination, made me relent. I closed the door, removed the chain, and let her in. Detective Reeves took in the state of my living room, the drawn curtains, the empty takeout containers, the general air of paranoia, with a raised eyebrow. "You want to tell me what's going on?" she asked. And so, haltingly at first, then in a rush, I told her everything. The sack in the woods, the bone, my encounters with Hoffman, and finally the horrific events of that rainy day in the forest. As I spoke, I waited for her expression to change, for her to dismiss me as a lunatic or clap me in handcuffs. But she listened intently, her face growing more grave with each passing minute. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this," she said. You believe me? I asked, incredulous. She nodded slowly. There have been rumors, whispers of strange experiments, of people going missing. But nothing concrete, nothing we could act on, until now. What do you mean? Detective Reeves reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. Hoffman's, I realized. James had been investigating a series of disappearances. He thought they were connected to an old research facility on the outskirts of town, a place that was supposedly shut down years ago. She flipped through the pages, showing me hastily scribbled notes and rough sketches. One page caught my eye, a crude drawing of a figure with mismatched limbs and an impossibly wide mouth. "Oh, God," I whispered. He was getting close to something, Reeves continued. Too close, apparently. And now... She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what had happened to Detective Hoffman. "So what do we do now?" I asked, a mix of fear and determination coursing through me. Detective Reeves's eyes met mine, her gaze steely. "We finish what Hoffman started. We find out what's really going on in Whispering Pines, and we put a stop to it. Are you with me?" I thought of the horrors I had witnessed, of the lives that had been lost, of the nightmarish creature that still haunted my dreams. I thought of Detective Hoffman, who had died trying to uncover the truth. "I'm in," I said. The next few days were a whirlwind of covert meetings and clandestine investigations. Detective Reeves and I pored over Hoffman's notes, piecing together the fragments of his investigation. We discovered references to a company called Chimera Biotech, which had operated the research facility near Whispering Pines until it was supposedly shut down 5 years ago due to ethical concerns. But Hoffman's notes suggested the facility was still active, hidden away in the depths of the forest. He had been tracking shipments of unusual chemicals and specialized equipment, all leading to a remote area deep in Whispering Pines. On October 31st, Halloween, fittingly enough, we decided it was time to act. We couldn't risk going through official channels. We had no idea how far the conspiracy reached or who we could trust. It would be just the two of us, venturing into the heart of the nightmare. As night fell, Detective Reeves and I made our way into Whispering Pines. The forest seemed alive with malevolent energy, every shadow concealing potential horrors. We followed a faint trail that Hoffman had marked on his map, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. After what felt like hours of trekking through the darkness, we came upon a clearing. In the center stood a nondescript concrete building, its walls stained with age and overgrown with vines. A faint hum of machinery emanated from within, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. "This is it," Reeves whispered, her hand resting on her holstered gun. "Are you ready?" I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to run. We approached the building cautiously, finding a heavy metal door with a keypad lock. Reeves pulled out a small device, borrowed from the police evidence locker, she'd said, and attached it to the keypad. After a tense minute, there was a soft beep, and the door clicked open. The interior of the facility was a stark contrast to its dilapidated exterior. Sterile white corridors stretched out before us, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, a faint cloying odor that made my stomach churn. We moved silently through the hallways, checking rooms as we went. Most were empty labs or offices, but as we descended deeper into the facility, we began to hear noises, muffled screams, inhuman growls, and the occasional wet, tearing sound that made my skin crawl. Finally, we came to a large set of double doors marked Primary Research. Reeves and I shared a look, both of us knowing that whatever lay beyond would change our lives forever. With a deep breath, we pushed the doors open. The scene that greeted us was straight out of a nightmare. The room was massive, filled with operating tables, strange machinery, and large fluid-filled tanks. And in those tanks... I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The tanks contained bodies, or parts of bodies floating in a viscous greenish liquid. Some were recognizably human, others weren't. Misshapen limbs, grotesquely enlarged organs, faces frozen in expressions of agony. "What the hell is this place?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Before Reeves could answer, a voice rang out from the other side of the room. "Ah, visitors. How delightful." We whirled around to see a man in a white lab coat step out from behind a bank of computers. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the harsh lighting. "Dr. Whitaker," Reeves growled, her gun trained on the man. "You're under arrest for—" "Oh, I don't think so," Whitaker interrupted, his voice eerily calm. "You see, you're trespassing in a very sensitive research facility, and I'm afraid I can't let you leave. At least, not in your current form." As he spoke, shapes began to emerge from the shadows around us. I recognized the patchwork monster from the forest, along with several other abominations, each more horrifying than the last. "You see," Whitaker continued, a maniacal gleam in his eye, "we're on the brink of a breakthrough, the next stage of human evolution, and you'll make excellent test subjects." The creatures closed in, their misshapen limbs reaching for us. Reeves opened fire, her shots echoing in the cavernous room. I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, swinging it wildly at the nearest monster. What followed was a chaotic blur of violence and terror. We fought desperately, but we were outnumbered and outmatched. I saw Reeves go down, overwhelmed by a mass of writhing limbs. I felt claws tearing at my flesh, inhuman strength dragging me towards one of the empty tanks. As consciousness began to fade, my last sight was of Dr. Whitaker looming over me, a syringe filled with glowing green liquid in his hand. "Don't worry," he said, his voice distant and distorted. "Soon you'll be part of something greater." Then darkness claimed me, and I knew no more. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time lost all meaning in the darkness, punctuated only by brief, agonizing moments of semi-awareness. Flashes of sterile rooms, the bite of scalpels, the burn of strange chemicals coursing through my veins, and always, always, the pain. A constant, all-encompassing agony that seemed to reshape my very being. When I finally clawed my way back to full consciousness, I almost wished I hadn't. I found myself floating in one of the green-filled tanks, tubes and wires snaking into my body. But it wasn't my body anymore. Not really. My limbs were elongated, joints bending at impossible angles. My skin was a patchwork of different textures and colors, surgical scars crisscrossing the uneven surface. And when I tried to scream, I felt rows of needle-sharp teeth scrape against a tongue that was far too long to be human. I thrashed in the tank, my new form moving with a horrible alien grace. The glass cracked, then shattered, spilling me onto the cold laboratory floor in a rush of viscous fluid. As I struggled to my feet, all four of them, I caught sight of my reflection in a nearby metal surface. The face that stared back at me was a nightmarish collage of mismatched features, barely recognizable as the person I once was. A low moan escaped my twisted lips, a sound of pure anguish and horror. What had they done to me? What had I become? The sound of slow applause drew my attention. Dr. Whitaker stood in the doorway, a look of triumphant madness on his face. "Magnificent," he breathed. "You're my greatest success yet, a perfect fusion of multiple genetic strands, with enhanced strength, agility, and regenerative capabilities. You'll be the prototype for a new species, a species that will inherit the Earth." As he spoke, more of his creations emerged from the shadows. The patchwork horrors I had once feared, now my kin. Among them, I recognized a twisted form that might once have been Detective Reeves, her face a mask of agony and rage. "You'll join your brethren soon enough," Whitaker continued. "Once your transformation is complete, once your old consciousness fades away entirely. For now, though, I think a field test is in order. He pressed a button on a small remote, and searing pain shot through my altered body. I roared in agony, my new form responding to commands I didn't understand. Go, Whitaker said, his eyes gleaming with insane glee. Go to Whispering Pines. Show the world what the future of humanity looks like. Against my will, I found myself moving, loping on all fours towards the exit. The other creatures followed, a pack of nightmares unleashed upon the unsuspecting world. As we burst out into the forest, a small part of my old self, buried deep beneath layers of mutated flesh and altered neurons, screamed in silent horror. What atrocities would I commit in this new form? How many innocent lives would be destroyed by Whitaker's insane vision? But those thoughts grew fainter with each passing moment, drowned out by new instincts and a hunger I couldn't comprehend. Days blurred into weeks as we prowled the depths of Whispering Pines. The forest, once a place of solace, had become our hunting ground. We moved like shadows in the night, striking terror into the hearts of those unfortunate enough to cross our path. But deep within the twisted mass of flesh and bone that I had become, a spark of my former self remained. It was a faint glimmer, easily overwhelmed by the primal urges that now dominated my existence. But it was there. And in rare moments of lucidity, I remembered who I was, what I had been. These moments often came in the quiet hours before dawn, when the forest was still and the hunger that drove us temporarily sated. I would find myself drawn to the outskirts of town, to the home where I had once lived a normal life. From the shadows, I watched as Rusty and Bella were walked by a new owner, their tails wagging happily. The sight brought a pang of something almost like grief to my mutated heart. One night, as we stalked the forest's edge, we came upon a group of campers. The other creatures moved in for the kill, but something made me hesitate. Among the terrified faces, I saw a child clutching a stuffed animal, a dog that looked remarkably like Rusty. In that moment, the last vestiges of my humanity surged to the forefront. With a roar that was equal parts pain and defiance, I turned on my monstrous brethren. The battle that ensued was savage and brutal, a chaos of slashing claws and gnashing teeth. I fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that this was my last chance at redemption. When it was over, the clearing was a scene of carnage. The other creatures lay dead or dying, their mismatched body parts twitching in the moonlight. The campers had fled, leaving behind their belongings in their haste to escape. Exhausted and wounded, I dragged myself back towards the secret facility. I knew what I had to do. The building was quiet as I entered, most of the staff having long since abandoned the project. Only Dr. Whitaker remained, driven by his mad vision to create a new world order. He looked up in surprise as I burst into his lab, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Ah, my masterpiece returns," he said, seemingly oblivious to my intentions. "Come to show me the fruits of your—" His words were cut short as I lunged, pinning him against the wall with inhuman strength. Terror filled his eyes as he realized his creations had turned against him. "Please," he gasped. "You don't understand. I was trying to save humanity, to elevate us to the next stage of evolution." But I was beyond words now. With a final monstrous roar, I ended the life of the man who had destroyed so many others in pursuit of his insane goal. In the aftermath, as alarms blared and the facility began to self-destruct, a fail-safe no doubt, I made my way to the heart of the complex. There, surrounded by bubbling vats of chemicals and humming machinery, I found what I was looking for, the central computer that contained all of Whitaker's research. With my mutated form, it was a simple matter to tear through the security measures and access the system. As the facility crumbled around me, I systematically erased every bit of data, every formula, every scrap of the madness that had led to this nightmare. Finally, as flames began to consume the lab, I stumbled out into the cool night air. The forest of whispering pines stretched out before me, no longer a place of terror, but a sanctuary where my monstrous form could hide from the world. I knew I could never return to my old life. The person I had been was gone, consumed by Whitaker's experiments. But perhaps in time, I could find a way to use this new form for good, to protect the innocence of the world from horrors they couldn't imagine. As dawn broke over the trees, casting the forest in a soft golden light, I retreated into the shadows. The nightmare of whispering pines was over, but for me, a new and uncertain future was just beginning. In the years that followed, whispered stories spread through the nearby towns, tales of a guardian creature that roamed the woods, frightening to behold, but never harming the innocent. Some dismissed these as urban legends, campfire stories meant to frighten children. But for those who had encountered true horror in whispering pines, for those who remembered the night when monsters walked among us, these stories offered a glimmer of hope. They were a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, a spark of humanity could survive. And deep in the heart of the forest, watching over the land that had once been my home, I continued my solitary vigil. A monster in form, perhaps, but with the heart of a protector. The last legacy of the terror that had once gripped whispering pines, and a silent promise that such horrors would never be allowed to rise again. The alarm pierced through the darkness of my bedroom at 4:01 a.m., startling me awake. I groaned, my body aching from the previous day's preparation, but the excitement of opening day quickly pushed away any lingering fatigue. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows of my secluded cabin nestled deep in the South Jersey Pine Barrens. I'm Ryan Hawthorne, a 35-year-old local who spent most of my life in these woods. Hunting and fishing aren't just hobbies for me, they're a way of life. The Pine Barrens have been my playground, my provider, and sometimes my tormentor. Little did I know that this day would change my perception of these familiar woods forever. As I pulled on my thermal underwear and layered up with camouflage, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the unusual cold. The weatherman had predicted temperatures dropping to -4 with the wind chill, a rarity for New Jersey. Or perhaps it was something else, a primal instinct warning me of unseen dangers lurking in the pre-dawn darkness. I made my way to the kitchen, my boots creaking on the old wooden floor. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As I waited, I peered out the window into the inky blackness. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying eerily in the biting wind. With my thermos filled and my gear packed, I stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath away. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face and made my way to my truck. The metal of the door handle was so cold, it almost burned my skin through my gloves. As I drove down the lonely dirt road leading deeper into the barrens, my headlights caught glimpses of movement in the underbrush. Probably just deer or foxes, I told myself. But a part of me wondered if there were other, less natural explanations for those fleeting shadows. I parked at my usual spot, about a mile from where I'd set up my new stand. This year, I decided to venture further into the woods, seeking a more challenging hunt. Now, as I shouldered my pack and gripped my shotgun, I questioned the wisdom of that decision. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness as I followed the trail of reflectors I'd set up weeks before. Each step took me further from civilization and deeper into the heart of the barrens. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of decay. My breath came out in plumes of white vapor, dissipating quickly in the frigid air. As I walked, memories of old legends and campfire stories about the Jersey Devil flooded my mind. I'd always scoffed at such tales, considering them nothing more than local folklore designed to scare tourists and children. But in the oppressive darkness of the pre-dawn forest, those stories suddenly felt all too real. I shook my head, trying to dispel such thoughts. I was a rational man, a hunter who knew these woods better than most. There was nothing out here that I couldn't handle. At least that's what I told myself as I continued my solitary trek into the heart of the Pine Barrens. The sky was just beginning to lighten, a faint grayish tinge on the eastern horizon as I approached my tree stand. I was about 25 yards away when I decided to take a short break and have a cigarette to calm my nerves. The eerie silence of the woods was getting to me, the usual pre-dawn chorus of birds conspicuously absent. I fumbled with my lighter, my gloved hands clumsy in the biting cold. As the flame flickered to life, illuminating my face in its warm glow, a sound shattered the silence. It wasn't the familiar snort of a deer or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. No, this was something else entirely. A grunt. No, not just a grunt. A snarl. Deep, guttural, and unmistakably aggressive. I froze, the unlit cigarette dangling from my lips, my hand still holding the lighter. The sound came again, longer this time, a rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It was close. Too close. My heart pounding, I slowly lowered the lighter and gripped my shotgun. Years of hunting experience took over as I scanned the surrounding darkness, straining my eyes to catch any sign of movement. The snarling continued, sometimes stopping for a moment before resuming with increased intensity. Then, without warning, it charged. The creature burst from the underbrush to my left, a dark mass of fur and muscle. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could make out a vague shape, like a massive boar, but wrong. Its head was too large, its snout too elongated, and those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural, almost intelligent malevolence. Training took over. I raised my shotgun and fired, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene in stark detail. I caught a glimpse of twisted features, of tusks where they shouldn't be, of too many limbs moving in unnatural coordination. Then darkness again, and the sound of the creature crashing away through the underbrush. My hands shook as I fumbled to reload, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What the hell was that thing? New Jersey didn't have wild boars, and even if it did, no boar looked like that. I needed to get to my tree stand. Now. Abandoning all pretense of stealth, I ran towards my tree. I was about 10 yards away when I heard it again, the sound of something large moving through the forest at high speed. But this time, it was behind me. Before I could turn, something slammed into my back with the force of a freight train. I was thrown forward, my face meeting the frozen ground with a sickening crunch. The taste of blood filled my mouth as I lay there dazed and winded. Whatever had hit me kept going, its heavy footfalls fading into the distance. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, the metallic tang of blood on my tongue. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. My shotgun lay a few feet away, and I crawled towards it, my fingers scrabbling in the leaf litter until they closed around the familiar shape of the stock. Using the gun as a crutch, I hauled myself to my feet and staggered the remaining distance to my tree stand. With trembling hands, I secured my safety harness and began to climb. Each movement sent waves of pain through my battered body, but fear drove me upward. Only when I reached the relative safety of my perch did I allow myself to collapse, gasping for breath. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full horror of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been attacked. Twice. By something that shouldn't exist. My mind struggled to make sense of what I'd seen, to reconcile it with the rational world I thought I knew. I sat in my tree stand until well after sunrise, my shotgun clutched tightly to my chest, jumping at every sound. The woods gradually came to life around me, but it all felt wrong somehow. The bird calls seemed mocking, the rustle of squirrels in the branches sinister. When I finally summoned the courage to descend and make my way back to my truck, I moved with a caution born of newfound fear. The Pine Barrens, once my second home, now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow concealed potential danger, every sound a possible harbinger of that thing's return. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. I knew I should report it, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. As I pulled up to my cabin, I made a decision. I would keep this to myself, at least for now. But I knew one thing for certain. My days of hunting alone in the deep woods were over. The days following my terrifying encounter in the woods passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, malevolent orbs staring back at me. The snarl that had shattered the pre-dawn silence echoed in my dreams, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours hunched over my laptop, searching for any explanation for what I'd seen. I scoured local wildlife reports, delved into cryptozoology forums, and even found myself reading about genetic mutations and government experiments. Nothing quite fit. The rational part of my brain tried to convince me that it had all been a hallucination brought on by the extreme cold and the eerie atmosphere of the pre-dawn forest. But the bruises that mottled my body and the lingering ache in my back served as constant reminders that what I'd experienced had been all too real. I became jumpy, starting at every unexpected sound. The creak of my cabin settling in the night wind became the growl of an unseen predator. The scratch of branches against my window in a storm transformed into the scraping of otherworldly claws seeking entry. My few friends in the area noticed the change in me. I'd always been something of a loner, but now I withdrew even further. How could I explain to them what had happened? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, lying for attention. So I made excuses, claimed I was coming down with something, and avoided their invitations to go hunting or fishing. As the days turned into weeks, my fear began to morph into a morbid curiosity. I found myself drawn back to the woods, though I never ventured as deep as I had on that fateful morning. I'd walk the edges of the forest, my shotgun always at the ready, scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. Sometimes, in the fading light of dusk, I thought I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line. A flash of fur, the glint of an unnatural eye, the shadow of a misshapen form. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there but the swaying pines and lengthening shadows. I began to question my sanity. Was I seeing things that weren't there? Had the encounter in the woods broken something in my mind, leaving me forever jumping at shadows? Or was there really something out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity to strike? The not knowing was almost worse than the fear. I found myself longing for another encounter, if only to prove to myself that I wasn't going mad. But at the same time, the thought of coming face to face with that thing again filled me with a bone-deep terror. As autumn deepened into winter, I fell into a routine of sorts. During the day, I'd go about my normal activities, chopping wood, maintaining my cabin, running errands in town. But my nights were spent in vigilant watchfulness, peering out into the darkness, my shotgun never far from reach. I installed motion-activated floodlights around my property, their harsh glare cutting through the night at the slightest disturbance. More often than not, they'd be triggered by deer or raccoons, but each time they blazed to life, my heart would race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. One particularly cold night in early December, I was jolted from an uneasy sleep by the lights suddenly flaring to life. I bolted upright, grabbing my shotgun from where it leaned against my bedside table. As I peered out the window, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the illuminated area, stood a figure. It was only there for a moment before it melted back into the shadows, but in that brief instant, I saw enough to send chills down my spine. It wasn't the creature from the woods. This was something different, but no less terrifying. The figure had been roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs were impossibly long, and its head had been wrong, elongated, and somehow misshapen. As it retreated into the darkness, I could have sworn I saw it turn to look directly at me, even though I was sure it couldn't have seen me through the window. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, my shotgun clutched to my chest, straining my ears for any sound of approach. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, searching for tracks or any sign of the nocturnal visitor. But the ground was frozen hard, revealing nothing. As I stood there in the pale morning light, surrounded by the silent pines, a realization settled over me like a shroud. The pine barrens held secrets far darker and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. And somehow, I had stumbled into the middle of it all. I knew then that I couldn't stay in my isolated cabin much longer. The solitude that had once been a comfort now felt like a vulnerability. But where could I go? Who would believe my story? And more importantly, would these entities, whatever they were, let me leave? As I turned to go back inside, a movement caught my eye. There, nailed to one of the trees at the edge of my property, was a piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. My blood ran cold as I approached it. The paper was blank except for a crude drawing, a stick figure with elongated limbs and a misshapen head. I tore the paper down, my hands shaking. This was no longer just about what I had seen in the woods. Someone, or something, was watching me, toying with me. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was trapped in a game whose rules I didn't understand. As I retreated to the relative safety of my cabin, I knew that my life would never be the same. The Pine Barrens had shown me a glimpse of a world beyond my understanding, and now that world was reaching out to me, whether I wanted it to or not. Months passed, and the horrors of that autumn morning began to fade into a sort of surreal memory. I told myself that the stress and isolation had gotten to me, that I had blown a simple animal encounter out of proportion. The strange figure I'd seen outside my cabin, a trick of the light, nothing more. By the time spring rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my head. Almost. As the days grew longer and warmer, I felt the old familiar pull of the outdoors. The Great Egg Harbor River, with its promise of striped bass, called to me. I had avoided my favorite fishing spots all winter, but now the lure was too strong to resist. I called up my buddy Mike, figuring some company would help keep the lingering unease at bay. We made plans to hit the river on a Saturday, aiming to catch the outgoing tide. The morning dawned overcast and cool, a light mist hanging over the river as we hiked the old trail to our favorite spot. The path wound through the woods, passing the ruins of an old shipbuilder's yard. As we walked, I found myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see glowing eyes or misshapen figures lurking in the shadows. "You okay, man?" Mike's voice snapped me out of my paranoid observations. "You seem jumpy." I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Just excited to finally get back out here, you know." Mike nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. I'd been distant over the winter, and though I'd made excuses about being busy with work, I knew he suspected there was more to it. We reached the old structure on the riverbank, a favorite haunt for the stripers we were after. The water gurgled and swirled around the crumbling concrete, creating the perfect hiding spots for big fish. As we set up our gear, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and a cool breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of ozone and wet earth. "Looks like we might get wet," Mike commented, eyeing the sky warily. I nodded, focused on tying a new lure to my line. "Yeah, but the fish should be biting right before the storm hits." For about an hour, we fished in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional splash of our lures hitting the water and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the heavens opened up. Rain pounded down in sheets, instantly soaking us to the skin. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. We scrambled to gather our gear, the sudden downpour making every movement a struggle. "The old building!" I shouted over the roar of the rain, gesturing towards the abandoned structure looming behind us. "We can wait it out in there." Mike nodded, his face a mask of grim determination, as we slogged through the quickly forming mud towards the dilapidated edifice. The building, once a hub of shipbuilding activity, now stood as a silent sentinel on the riverbank, its windows dark and empty, its walls covered in graffiti and scarred by time. As we approached, a sense of unease settled over me. Something about the building seemed off. The shadows within seemed deeper than they should be, the silence more profound than mere abandonment could account for. But with the storm raging around us, we had little choice. We ducked through a gap where a door had once been, the sudden absence of rain almost deafening. Water dripped from our clothes and gear, forming small puddles on the dusty floor. The air inside was stale and musty, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place. Something organic and vaguely unsettling. "Well, this is cozy," Mike quipped, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. He moved further into the room, his footsteps stirring up small clouds of dust. "Hey, check it out. There's a second floor. Maybe we can get a view of the river from up there." I hesitated, that feeling of wrongness intensifying. "I don't know, Mike. The structure might not be stable. Maybe we should just stay down here." Mike was already heading for the stairs. "Come on, man. Where's your sense of adventure? We came out here to explore, didn't we?" Reluctantly, I followed him up the creaking stairs, each step sending shivers of apprehension down my spine. The second floor was a long hallway with rooms on the right and a balcony overlooking the main floor on the left. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it typical tags and crude drawings, but some seemed older, stranger. Symbols I didn't recognize and couldn't begin to decipher. Mike headed for the first door, his hand reaching for the rusted knob. Suddenly he stopped, his body going rigid. "You know what?" he said, his voice oddly strained. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Let's head back down." I was about to agree when something caught my eye, a flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mike shook his head, already turning back toward the stairs. "I didn't see anything, and I don't want to. This place gives me the creeps. Let's go." But I couldn't move. That sense of wrongness had crystallized into a tangible feeling of dread, rooting me to the spot. As Mike's footsteps faded down the stairs, I found myself drawn further down the hallway, towards the last door. With each step, the feeling intensified. It was as if all the sorrow, fear, and malice that had ever existed in this place was concentrated behind that final door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The door swung open with a long, low creak. The room beyond was dark, the lone window covered in years of grime. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes, strange, twisted forms that seemed to writhe in the shadows. And in the center of it all, a figure. It was small, child-sized, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Its proportions were off, its limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. And its face, where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. The figure turned towards me, moving with a fluidity that defied physics. And then, impossibly, a mouth opened in that blank face. A gash filled with needle-like teeth. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, taking the stairs 3 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I burst out of the building into the rain, which had slackened to a steady drizzle. Mike was there, looking concerned and a little annoyed. "Jesus, Ryan, what the hell happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the building, trying to convey through gesture the horror I'd witnessed. Mike's expression changed from annoyance to concern. "Okay, man. Okay, let's get out of here. We can come back for the rest of the gear later." As we hurried back along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent jolts of fear through me. It wasn't until we reached Mike's truck that I began to feel like I could breathe again. The drive back was silent, Mike shooting concerned glances my way every few minutes. I knew I owed him an explanation, but how could I possibly describe what I'd seen? How could I make him understand when I didn't understand it myself? That night, alone in my cabin, I finally allowed myself to break down. The tears came in great, heaving sobs as the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed over me. This wasn't just a one-time encounter with something strange in the woods. This was something more, something that defied explanation or rationality. As I sat there, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my home, I realized that everything had changed. The world I thought I knew, the reality I had always taken for granted, had been torn away. In its place was something darker, stranger, and infinitely more terrifying. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed help, needed to understand what was happening. But who could I turn to? Who would believe me? As if in answer to my unspoken question, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number and contained only 4 words. "We need to talk." The text message haunted me for days. I debated responding, torn between my desperate need for answers and my fear of delving deeper into whatever dark mystery I'd stumbled upon. In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I replied with a simple, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "Someone who knows what you've seen. Meet me at the Crossroads Diner, tomorrow, noon." The Crossroads Diner was a small, nondescript eatery on the outskirts of town, the kind of place truckers and locals frequented for cheap coffee and greasy food. It was public enough to feel safe, but isolated enough for a private conversation. I arrived early, my nerves jangling with each step. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars nursing cups of coffee at the counter. I slid into a booth near the back, positioning myself so I could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. At precisely noon, the bell over the door jingled. A woman entered, her eyes scanning the diner before settling on me. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age and worry, her eyes sharp and penetrating. Without a word, she slid into the booth across from me. Up close, I could see the deep shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up the menu. "You're Ryan Hawthorne," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "And you are?" "Margaret Blackburn," she replied, her voice low and gravelly. "I've been watching you, Ryan, ever since your encounter in the woods last fall." A chill ran down my spine. "How do you—" She held up a hand, cutting me off. "I know because I've seen it too. We all have, those of us who know the truth about this place." The waitress approached, and Margaret ordered coffee for both of us. When she left, Margaret leaned in, her voice dropping even lower. "The Pine Barrens hold secrets, Ryan. Ancient secrets. Things that most people can't even begin to comprehend. What you saw in the woods, what you encountered in that old building by the river, they're just the tip of the iceberg." My mind reeled, struggling to process her words. But what were they? Some kind of animal? A hallucination? Margaret's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "If only it were that simple. No, Ryan. What you've encountered are entities that exist beyond our normal perception of reality. Some call them spirits, others demons. The local Lenape people had their own names for them, passed down through generations." She paused as the waitress returned with our coffee. When she left, Margaret continued. These entities have always been here, as much a part of the pine barrens as the trees and the sand. Most of the time they remain hidden, glimpsed only out of the corner of your eye or in the depths of the darkest night. But sometimes they become more active, more visible. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a deep, abiding fear. Because something is changing. The balance that has kept them in check for centuries is shifting. And if it's not stopped, the consequences will be unimaginable. I sat back, my head spinning. Part of me wanted to dismiss her words as the ravings of a madwoman, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. And deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. What can we do? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Margaret smiled, a grim, determined expression. That's why I contacted you, Ryan. There's a group of us, people who know the truth, who've dedicated our lives to maintaining the balance. We need your help. As she spoke, laying out the existence of a secret society dedicated to protecting the world from otherworldly threats, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. This was insanity. And yet, it was the first thing that had made sense since that fateful morning in the woods. I'm in, I said, surprising myself with my conviction. Whatever it takes, I want to understand. I want to help. Margaret nodded, relief evident in her eyes. Good, because we're running out of time. The entities are growing bolder, manifesting more frequently. We believe they're building towards something big, something that could tear the very fabric of our reality apart. As we left the diner, the weight of my new knowledge pressing down on me like a physical force, Margaret handed me a small, leather-bound journal. This contains some of what we know, she said. Study it, memorize it, and be ready. I'll contact you again soon. That night, as I pored over the journal by lamplight, my world expanded and contracted simultaneously. The pages were filled with accounts of encounters similar to mine, stretching back centuries. Detailed descriptions of entities that defied comprehension, rituals to ward them off, maps marked with places of power and danger. As I read, I began to see the pine barrens with new eyes. The forests I'd known all my life were now a battlefield, a thin veil between our world and something infinitely more terrifying. And I was now a soldier in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with possibilities and dangers. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I would embrace this new reality, this hidden world. I would learn, prepare, and fight if necessary. Because if Margaret was right, the fate of everything I knew and loved hung in the balance. And I was damned if I was going to sit idly by and watch it fall. The weeks following my meeting with Margaret were a whirlwind of preparation and revelation. I devoured the contents of the journal she had given me, my mind struggling to comprehend the vastness of the hidden world it described. Ancient rituals, arcane symbols, accounts of encounters that defied rational explanation. It was all there, a secret history of the pine barrens that few had ever known. Margaret contacted me sporadically, always through untraceable means, burner phones, encrypted emails, even once through a message left under a specific pine tree deep in the woods. Each communication brought new information, new tasks to complete. I learned to create protective sigils, tracing them in salt around my cabin. I memorized incantations in languages long dead, their syllables feeling strange and powerful on my tongue. I trained my body and mind, pushing myself to new limits of endurance and perception. Through it all, the entities Margaret had spoken of made their presence known. Shadows that moved against the wind, whispers in empty rooms, fleeting glimpses of impossible forms at the edge of my vision. But now, armed with knowledge and purpose, I faced these manifestations with determination rather than fear. It was a month after our initial meeting when Margaret finally deemed me ready for what she called the initiation. Her message was cryptic. Midnight, the old cedar grove. Come alone and be prepared for anything. I knew the place she meant. An ancient stand of cedar trees deep in the heart of the barrens, far from any trails or roads. As I made my way there under the light of a waning moon, every sense was on high alert. The forest seemed alive in a way I'd never experienced before, pulsing with an energy that set my teeth on edge. The grove itself was a place of primal power. The cedars, gnarled and twisted with age, formed a natural circle around a small clearing. As I stepped into that space, I felt a change in the air, as if I'd crossed some invisible threshold into another world. Margaret was there, along with 5 others, 3 men and 2 women, all of varying ages but sharing the same look of grim determination I'd seen in Margaret's eyes that day in the diner. They stood in a loose circle, each holding a candle that cast flickering shadows across their faces. "Welcome, Ryan," Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority I hadn't heard before. "You stand now at the crossroads of worlds. Are you prepared to take the final step, to see the truth that lies beyond the veil?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry with anticipation and fear. "I am." What followed was a ceremony unlike anything I could have imagined. Chants in languages that resonated in my bones, symbols drawn in earth and fire, rituals that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around us. As the ceremony reached its climax, I felt a shift, not just in the world around me, but within myself. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. The grove came alive with light and movement. Beings of impossible geometry flitted between the trees, their forms shifting and changing with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to ripple with currents of energy, visible now to my enhanced perception. And there, at the center of it all, stood a figure that defied description. It was as if someone had taken all the primal forces of nature, the fury of a storm, the majesty of a mountain, the depth of the sea, and condensed them into a single awe-inspiring form. When it spoke, its voice resonated not in my ears but in the very core of my being. "Ryan Hawthorne," it said, my name carrying a weight and significance I'd never felt before. "You have been chosen. The balance teeters on the edge of chaos. Will you stand as a guardian against the coming darkness?" In that moment, faced with the raw power of creation and destruction, I understood the true magnitude of what I was being asked to do. This wasn't just about protecting the Pine Barrens, or even our world. This was about maintaining the very fabric of reality itself. "I will," I said, my voice strong and sure despite the trembling in my limbs. The entity, for lack of a better term, seemed to nod, though the motion was more a shift in the energy surrounding it than a physical movement. "Then receive our blessing and our burden." A surge of energy slammed into me, filling every cell of my body with liquid fire. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by sensations I had no words to describe. Visions flashed before my eyes, past, present, and possible futures, all intertwined in a tapestry of cosmic significance. When it was over, I found myself lying on my back in the clearing, the first light of dawn peeking through the cedars. The others stood around me, their faces a mix of concern and respect. Margaret helped me to my feet, her touch steadying me as I swayed. "Welcome to the Order," she said softly. "Your real work begins now." As we left the grove, I knew that my life had changed irrevocably. I was no longer just Ryan Hawthorne, local hunter and fisherman. I was now a guardian, a protector of realities, initiated into secrets that most of humanity could never comprehend. The Pine Barrens stretched out before me, familiar yet utterly transformed. With my new perception, I could see the currents of energy flowing through the land, the hidden doorways to other realms, the creatures that existed between the spaces we normally perceive. It was beautiful, terrifying, and overwhelming. But as the weight of my new responsibilities settled onto my shoulders, I felt a sense of purpose that I'd never known before. Whatever challenges lay ahead. In the months following my initiation, life took on a surreal quality. By day, I maintained the facade of normality, tending to my cabin, going into town for supplies, even the occasional fishing trip with unsuspecting friends. But my nights were filled with patrols of the Barrens, warding rituals and clandestine meetings with other members of the Order. I learned that our group, officially known as the Guardians of the Veil, had existed for centuries. Its members were drawn from all walks of life: teachers, park rangers, local politicians, and more, all united by their awareness of the hidden world and their commitment to protecting the balance. Margaret, I discovered, was more than just a member. She was our local leader, a position she'd held for over 3 decades. Under her guidance, I honed my newfound abilities. I learned to sense the subtle shifts in energy that signaled an entity's presence, to communicate with the spirits of the land, and even to manipulate the threads of reality itself to a small degree. But for all our vigilance, the situation in the Barrens was deteriorating. Entity sightings were becoming more frequent and more violent. Hikers reported being chased by shadows that moved against the wind. Campers woke to find impossible geometries carved into the trees around their sites. And in the nearby towns, an oppressive atmosphere of dread began to settle, leading to increased reports of nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and erratic behavior. It was during a particularly tense meeting of the Guardians that we received the news we'd been dreading. Elias, our resident scholar and expert on interdimensional phenomena, burst into Margaret's living room, his usually calm demeanor shattered. "It's happening," he gasped, his face pale and drawn. "The convergence, it's starting." A hush fell over the room. We'd all heard whispers of the convergence, a rare alignment of cosmic forces that weakened the barriers between dimensions. But according to our records, it wasn't due for another 50 years. Margaret's voice cut through the silence. "How long do we have?" Elias shook his head, his hands trembling as he spread out a series of charts and diagrams on the coffee table. "Days, a week at most. The signs are unmistakable. The energy patterns, the increased entity activity, it's all pointing to a major event centered right here in the Barrens." I leaned in, studying the complex web of lines and symbols on Elias's charts. Even with my limited experience, I could see the pattern forming, a spiral of energy converging on a single point deep in the heart of the Pine Barrens. "What happens if we can't stop it?" I asked, dreading the answer. Margaret's face was grim. "Best case scenario, a massive incursion of entities into our world, beyond anything we've ever dealt with before. Worst case." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "The complete collapse of the barrier between dimensions. Reality as we know it would cease to exist." The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. We were facing a threat beyond anything in living memory, with the fate of not just the Pine Barrens, but potentially the entire world hanging in the balance. "So what do we do?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Margaret looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each of us in turn. "We prepare. We gather every resource, call in every favor, and when the time comes, we stand together against whatever comes through." The next few days were a blur of feverish activity. We scoured ancient texts for forgotten rituals, reinforced the wards around key locations in the Barrens, and reached out to other chapters of the Guardians across the country for support. I found myself thrust into a central role, my unique connection to the land, forged through years of hunting and living in the Barrens, proving invaluable in our preparations. I led scouting parties deep into the woods, mapping out the shifting energies and identifying potential weak points in the dimensional barrier. As we worked, the world around us seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the buzz of insects, fell silent. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that set our teeth on edge. Even those unaware of the coming crisis could sense that something was wrong, as evidenced by the steadily emptying campgrounds and the increase in closed for renovation signs on local businesses. It was during one of our scouting missions, just 3 days before Elias's predicted convergence, that we had our first major encounter. I was leading a small team, myself, Elias, and a newer member named Cassie, through a particularly dense section of the barrens when the air around us suddenly grew cold. Our breaths came out in visible puffs despite the summer heat. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching for us like grasping fingers. And then we saw it, a tear in the very fabric of reality, hanging in the air like a jagged wound. Through the rift, we caught glimpses of a world that defied comprehension. Impossible colors swirled in patterns that hurt to look at. Shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could process writhed and pulsed. And emerging from this maelstrom of chaos were things. Entities beyond anything we'd encountered before. They poured through the rift, a tide of nightmare-made flesh. Some were vaguely humanoid, but with too many limbs, joints bending in impossible ways. Others were more abstract, masses of tentacles and eyes and gnashing teeth. And all of them radiated an aura of otherworldly malevolence that sent waves of primal terror through me. Training took over. Cassie began the warding chant, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. Elias pulled out a device of his own creation, a sort of interdimensional tuning fork, and began adjusting the local vibrational frequency to destabilize the entities. And me? I did what I'd been preparing for all these months. I reached deep into the power that flowed through the land, drawing it up through my feet, through my body, focusing it into a pure beam of protective energy. As the first wave of entities reached us, I released that energy in a blinding flash of light. The creatures recoiled, their forms seeming to waver and distort. But more kept coming. For every one we forced back, 2 more took its place. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and quickly running out of options. Just as I thought we were about to be overwhelmed, a new sound cut through the chaos, a deep resonant tone that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and suddenly the trees around us came alive. Branches lashed out, entangling the entities. Roots erupted from the ground, forming barriers between us and the onslaught. And there, emerging from the trunk of the largest pine, was a figure I recognized from my initiation. The nature spirit, the embodiment of the barrens itself. Its presence turned the tide. The entities, faced with the combined might of our defenses and the raw power of the land, began to retreat. One by one, they were sucked back through the rift, which slowly began to close. As the last of the creatures disappeared, and the tear sealed itself with a sound like tearing silk, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The spirit regarded us silently for a moment before melting back into the tree from which it had emerged. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As we made our weary way back to report what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a preview of what was to come. The convergence was still approaching, and with it, a threat that made this encounter look like a mere skirmish. Our time was running out. The final confrontation loomed on the horizon, and the fate of everything we knew hung in the balance. As the pine barrens grew darker and more ominous around us, I steeled myself for what was to come. Whatever happened, I knew that the next few days would determine not just my fate, but the fate of our entire reality. The day of the convergence dawned with an eerie stillness. The sky was a uniform gray, as if all color had been leached from the world. As I stood on the porch of my cabin, preparing for what lay ahead, I could feel the wrongness in the air. A palpable sense of reality stretched to its breaking point. We had spent the last 48 hours in a frenzy of preparation. Every guardian within a 500-mile radius had converged on the Pine Barrens. Our headquarters, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, had been transformed into a war room with maps, mystical artifacts, and weapons both mundane and arcane covering every available surface. Margaret had been in constant motion, coordinating our defenses, assigning teams, and poring over ancient texts for any advantage we could gain. I had never seen her look so haggard, the weight of leadership etched into the lines of her face. As I made my way to HQ for our final briefing, I couldn't help but reflect on how much my life had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, my biggest concern had been where to set up my deer stand for the coming season. Now I was preparing to face down forces that could unravel the very fabric of our reality. The warehouse was a hive of activity when I arrived. Guardians from all walks of life were gearing up. Park rangers strapping on body armor alongside academics, double-checking mystical formulae. Local shopkeepers standing shoulder to shoulder with hardened monster hunters. Margaret called us to order, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter. Listen up, everyone. This is it. Everything we've trained for, everything we've sacrificed for, it all comes down to the next few hours. She laid out the plan. We would split into teams, each responsible for a different aspect of our defense. Some would focus on reinforcing the weakening dimensional barriers. Others would engage directly with any entities that managed to break through. And a select few, including myself, would attempt to close the convergence point itself. Make no mistake, Margaret continued, her eyes sweeping the room. This will be the fight of our lives. Many of us may not make it back. But remember what we're fighting for. Not just for the Pine Barrens. Not just for our world. But for the very concept of reality as we know it. As we moved out, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. In the distance, I could hear sounds that had no place in this world, chittering whispers, discordant melodies, and beneath it all, a deep subsonic rumble that I felt more than heard. Our team, consisting of myself, Elias, Cassie, and two seasoned guardians named Ravi and Samantha, made our way deep into the heart of the Barrens. With each step, the world around us seemed to warp and twist. Colors bled into one another. Shadows moved against the light, and more than once I caught glimpses of impossible geometries out of the corner of my eye. We reached the convergence point just as all hell broke loose. The sky above us tore open, revealing a swirling vortex of cosmic energy. Through this rift poured a nightmarish horde of entities, some familiar from our previous encounters, others so alien and terrifying that my mind recoiled from the sight of them. Now! Elias shouted, pulling out the device he'd been working on, a complex arrangement of crystals, circuits, and arcane symbols that he claimed could disrupt the convergence. We formed a protective circle around him as he began the activation sequence. Cassie and I focused on maintaining a barrier of protective energy, while Ravi and Samantha engaged directly with the encroaching entities. The air crackled with eldritch energy as we fought. I drew deep on the power of the land, channeling it through my body in ways I never thought possible. Bolts of pure force lashed out from my hands, driving back the creatures that threatened to overwhelm us. But for every entity we repelled, two more took its place. The sheer variety of horrors we faced was staggering. Beings of living shadow, crystalline monstrosities that shattered and reformed at will, things that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could comprehend. Just as I thought we might be overrun, a familiar presence made itself known. The spirit of the Pine Barrens, the entity I had encountered during my initiation, manifested in all its terrifying glory. It joined our battle, its power dwarfing our own, driving back the invading forces with primal fury. With this momentary respite, Elias was able to complete the activation of his device. A pulse of energy exploded outward, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The entities hung suspended in mid-air, the swirling vortex above us stilled. Then, with a sound like reality itself screaming, the rift began to close, The invading entities were sucked back through, their unearthly shrieks fading as they disappeared. The cosmic energies that had threatened to tear our world apart receded, leaving behind an almost painful normalcy. As the last of the anomalies faded, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted beyond measure. The forest around us slowly came back to life, birds cautiously resuming their songs, small animals emerging from hiding. We had done it. We had faced down the impossible and emerged victorious. The convergence had been stopped, the barriers between worlds restored. But as we made our weary way back to headquarters, I knew that this was not truly an end, but a beginning. The veil had been lifted, and I could never unsee what I had witnessed. The world was vaster, stranger, and more perilous than I had ever imagined. As we gathered at the warehouse, battered but alive, Margaret addressed us one final time. "Today, we've won a great victory," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But our work is far from over. The barriers between worlds will always be fragile, and there will always be those who seek to exploit that fragility. We must remain vigilant, ready to stand against whatever threats may come." Looking around at my fellow guardians, some faces familiar, others new, all forever changed by what we had experienced. I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had known before. This was my calling, my duty. To stand as a protector of reality itself, a guardian of the veil between worlds. As I returned to my cabin that night, the pine barrens stretched out around me, familiar yet forever changed. I knew that danger still lurked in the shadows, that cosmic horrors still waited just beyond the veil of our reality. But I also knew that we, would be ready to face them. For in the heart of the pine barrens, in the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the play of shadows in the deepening twilight, a new chapter had begun. And I, Ryan Hawthorne, once a simple hunter and fisherman, now stood as a guardian of realities, a protector of the veil, ready to face whatever nightmares might come.